So hello and welcome back yet again to Beverly of Graustark by George Barr McCutcheon. Um, First of all, Happy New Year's Eve. I hope you guys are doing something fun tonight. I'm probably not, honestly. I don't really do anything exciting. I mean, I live out in the middle of the woods. I'll probably give some extra bird seed to my birds or something. But if you are going out doing any sort of New Year's revelry, watching the ball drop, all of those other exciting things, have a blast, but be responsible. If you're going to be celebrating and imbibing in the spirits, be sure and have like a designated driver and all of those other good things, but have fun, you know? Party hard, all of those other good things. I don't think I've ever actually been to a New Year's Eve party. I'm not really a party person, so that makes perfect sense. I mean, most New Year's Eves, I either play World of Warcraft or just kind of read a book or something like that. That's my idea of a party. But I wonder what Beverly's idea of a New Year's Eve party would be. I mean, pretending to be a princess, obviously. So, yeah. Anyway, Happy New Year's Eve. If you are doing anything fun, drop it in the comments down below. I'm always interested to hear what everybody else is doing. I mean, do you have any sort of like traditional New Year's meal? I was reading that some cultures like open up all the doors and windows to let out the new old year and let in the new year. There's the ball drop thing. I think I saw when I was a kid that like I think in Japan you eat soba noodles. I have actually done that. Soba noodles are delicious, by the way. If you've never had them and you can find them, they're really good. They're made out of buckwheat, so they have a little more chew than a regular noodle, and they're actually pretty good. I might have some in the cupboard. I might have to make something with soba for New Year's. But I know that there's red beans and rice, which I like rice. Not a bean lover, so that's never going to be any of my New Year's meals, but interesting. All sorts of different things. Also, I have to decide what to do behind us. I'll figure it out sometime today because I think it's time to take down all of the Christmas stuff, which is sad because I'm really liking it. My tree that I made, it's still green. I'm really impressed, and my little Christmas gnomes that I made and are out guarding the end of my driveway, they're also still green. Spruce trees are amazing. Anyway, enough of all that. You guys aren't here to just listen to me babble. Although if you are, that's fine too. We're going to jump back in to Beverly of Graustark by George Barr McCutcheon, and we are going to be reading Chapter 11, The Royal Coach of Graustark. Wonder what sort of nonsense Beverly's going to get up to this time. The 2 weeks following Beverly Calhoun's advent into the royal household were filled with joy and wonder for her. Daily, she sent glowing letters to her father, mother, and brothers in Washington, elaborating vastly upon the paradise into which she had fallen. To her highly emotional mind, the praises of Graustark had been poorly sung. The huge old castle, relic of the feudal days, with its turrets and bastions and portcullises, impressed her with a never-ending sense of wonder. Its great halls and stairways, its chapel, throne room, the armor closet, its underground passages and dungeons, all united to fill her imaginative soul with the richest, rarest joys of romance. Simple American girl that she was, unused to the rigorous etiquette of royalty, she found embarrassment in the first confusion of events, but she didn't take long recovering her poise. Her apartments were near those of the Princess Yetive. In the private speech enjoyed by these young women, all manner of restraint was abandoned by the visitor, and every vestige of royalty slipped away from the princess. Count Halifort and his adorable wife, the Countess Yvonne, both of whom had grown old in the court, found the girl and her strange servant a source of true wonder and delight. Some days after Beverly's arrival, there came to the castle Harry Anguish and his wife, the vivacious Dagmar. With them came the 1-year-old cooing babe who was to overthrow the heart and head of every being in the household, from the princess on down. The tiny Dagmar became queen at once, and no one disputed her rule. Anguish, a painter, became Anguish the strategist and soldier. He planned with Minister Laurie and the rest of the cabinet, advancing some of the most harebrained projects that ever encouraged a discussion in a solemn conclave. The staid, cautious ministers looked upon him with wonder, but so plausible did he make his proposals appear that they were forced to consider them seriously. The old Count of Marlanx held him in great disdain and did not hesitate to expose his contempt, but these did not disturb Anguish in the least, for he was as optimistic as sunshine. His plan for the recapture of Prince Gabriel was ridiculously improbable, but it was afterwards seen that it had been attempted with much distress, and any delay might actually have been avoided if they had listened to him. Yetive and Beverly, along with Dagmar and the baby, made merry while all the men were in council. Their mornings were spent in the shady parks surrounding the castle, and their afternoons in driving, riding, and walking. Oftentimes, the princess was barred from these simple pleasures by just dint of her position. She was obliged to grant audiences, observe customs of state, attend to the charities that came under her supervision, and to confer with the nobles on affairs of weight and importance. Beverly, she delighted in the throne room and the underground passages, which signified more to her than anyone else. She was shown the room in which Laurie had foiled the Viennese who had tried to abduct Princess Yetive, the dungeon where Gabriel had spent his first days of confinement she delighted in, and the tower in which Laurie had been held prisoner, and, of course, the monastery up in the clouds were places of unusual interest to Beverly. Soon, the people of the city began to recognize the beautiful American girl who was a guest in the castle, and a certain amount of homage was paid to her. Whenever she rode or drove in the streets with her attendant soldiers, the people bowed as deeply and respectfully as they did to the princess herself, and Beverly was just as grand and gracious as if she had been born with a scepter in her hand. The soft, moonlit nights charmed Beverly with a sense of rapture she had never known before. With the castle brilliantly illuminated, the halls and the drawing rooms filled with courtiers, and the harpists at their posts, with the military band playing out in the parade ground, all of the balconies and porches offering their most inviting allurements, it was no wonder that Beverly was entranced. War had no terror for her. If she thought about it at all, it was with the fear that it might disturb the dream into which she had fallen. True, there was little or nothing to distress the most timid during these first days. The controversy between the principalities was at a standstill, although there was not an hour in which preparations for the worst were neglected. But to Beverly Calhoun, it meant very little when sentiment was laid aside. To Yetive and her people, this probable war with Dawsbergen, though it truly did mean everything. Dangloss, going back and forth between Edelweiss and the frontier north of Ganlook, where the best of the police and the Secret Service watched with the sleepless eyes of a lynx, he kept bringing unsettling news to the ministry. Axphian troops were engaged in the annual maneuvers just across the border in their own territory. Normally, these were held in the plains near the capital, and there was a sinister significance in the fact that this year they were being carried on the rough southeastern extremity of the principality within a day's march of the Graustark line, and they were being held fully 2 months earlier than normal. The doughty baron reported that the foot, horse, and artillery were engaged in drills and that fully 8,000 men were massed in the south of Axphen. The fortifications of Ganlook, Labat, and other towns in northern Graustark were strengthened with almost as much care as those in the south, where the conflict with Dawsbergen might first be expected. General Marlanx and his staff rested not day or night. The army of Graustark was as ready as it could be. Underneath the castle's happy exterior, there smoldered the fire of battle and the tremor of defiance. Late one afternoon, Beverly Calhoun and Mrs. Anguish drove up in state to the tower wherein Dangloss and his watchdogs were sitting. The scowl left Dangloss's face as far as nature would permit it, and he welcomed the ladies warmly. "I've come to ask about my friend the goat hunter," said Beverly, her cheeks a trifle rosier than normal. "He is far from an amenable person, your highness," said Dangloss. When discussing Baldos, he never failed to address Beverly as your highness, as Yediv's directive had directed him. "The fever is gone, and he is able to walk without much pain, but he is as restless as a witch. Following instructions, I have not questioned him concerning his plans, but I fancy he's eager to get back into the hills." "What did he say when you gave him my message?" said Beverly. "Which one, your highness?" he asked, with tantalizing density. "Why, the suggestion that he should come to Edelweiss for better treatment," said Beverly. "He said he was extremely grateful for your kind offices, but did not deem it advisable to come to the city. He requested me to thank you on his behalf, and to tell you he will never forget what you have done for him." "So he refuses to come to Edelweiss?" said Beverly irritably. "Yes, your highness. You see, he still regards himself with disfavor since he's a fugitive. It is hardly fair to blame him for respecting the security of the hills." "Well, I hoped I might induce him to give up his old life and engage in something perfectly honest, although, mind you, Baron Dangloss, I do not question his integrity in the least. He should have a chance to prove himself worthy, that's all. This morning, I petitioned Count Marlanx to give him a place in the castle guard." "My dear Miss Calhoun, the princess has—" "Her Highness has sanctioned the request," said Beverly. "And the Count has promised to discover a vacancy," said Dagmar, with a smile that the Baron understood. "This is the first time on record that old Marlanx has ever done anything to oblige anyone except for himself. It's wonderful, Miss Calhoun. What spell do you Americans cast over rock and metal that they become like sand in your fingers?" said the Baron, a bit of admiration and irritation in his eyes. "Well, you're just a flatterer, aren't you?" said Beverly, so happily that the Count caught his breath. I believe that you can conquer even that stubborn fellow in Ganlook, he told her, fumbling with his glasses. He is the most obstinate person I know, and yet in 10 minutes I think you could bring him to terms. Obviously, he wouldn't be able to resist you. Baldos does still think I'm the princess, right? He does, and he swears by you. Well then, my mind is made up. I'm going to go to Ganlook, and I'm going to bring him back with me willy-nilly. He is too good of a man to be lost in the hills. Goodbye, Baron Dangloss. Thank you ever so much. Oh, yes, will you write an order delivering him over to me? The hospital people might be, disobliging, as well you know. It will be in your highness's hands this evening. The next morning, with Colonel Quinnox and a small escort, Beverly Calhoun set off in one of the royal coaches for Ganlook, accompanied by faithful Aunt Fanny. She carried the order from Baron Dangloss and a letter from Yetive to the Countess Rallowitz, ensuring hospitality overnight in that northern town. Lori and the royal household entered merrily into her project, and Beverly went away with the godspeeds of all. The Iron Count himself rode next to her coach to the city gates, which was an unheard of courtesy. Now, you will be sure to find a nice place for him in the castle guard, won't you, Count Marlanx? Said Beverly, her hopes as fresh as a daisy in dew, and her confidence supreme. The Count promised this faithfully, even eagerly. Colonel Quinnox, trained as he was in the diplomacy of silence, could scarcely contain his astonishment at this conquest of the hardened old warrior. Although the afternoon was well spent before Beverly made it to Ganlook, she was resolved to visit the patient at once, relying upon her resourcefulness to get his promise to start with her for Edelweiss the next day. The coach delivered her at the hospital door in a grand style. When the visitor was ushered into the snug little anteroom of the governor's office, her heart was throbbing and her composure was undergoing a most unusual amount of strain. It annoyed Beverly to discover that the approaching contact with a humble goat hunter was giving her such unmistakable symptoms of being perturbed. From an upstairs window in the hospital, the convalescent but quite unhappy patient watched her approach and arrival. His sore, lonely heart gave a leap of joy, for the days had seemed long since she had left. He had had time to think during these days as well, turning over in his mind all of the details in connection with their meeting and subsequent intercourse. It became to dawn upon him that she might not be all she was assumed to be. Doubts assailed him, and suspicions grew into amazing forms of certainty. There were times when he laughed sardonically at himself for being taken in by this strange but charming young woman. But through it all, his heart and mind were being drawn more and more towards her. More than once he called himself a fool, and more than once he dreamed foolish dreams of her, princess or not. Of one thing he was certain. He had come to love the adventure for the sake of what it promised, and there was no bitterness below his suspicions. Arrayed in clean linen and presentable clothes, pale from being indoors and having the fever, but once more the straight and strong cavalier of the hills, he hastened into her presence when the summons came for him to go down. He dropped to one knee and he kissed her hand, determined to play the game notwithstanding his doubts. As he arose, she glanced for a flitting second into his dark eyes, and her own long lashes fluttered. "Your Highness," he said gratefully. "Oh, how well and strong you look," she said quickly. "Some of your tan is gone, but you look as though you were never ill. Are you quite recovered?" "They say that I'm good as new," he told her. A trifle weak and uncertain in my lower extremities, but a few days of exercise in the mountain air will overcome all of that. Is all well with you in Graustark? They give me no news here. By whose order, I don't know. Turnabout is fair play, sir. It is a well-established fact that you have given them no news. Yes, all is well with me and mine. Were you beginning to think that I had deserted you? It's been 2 weeks, hasn't it? Ah, Your Highness, I realize you have much more important things to do than think of poor Baldos. I am very grateful for this sign of any interest in my welfare. Your visit is the brightest experience of my life. You need to sit down, said Beverly suddenly. You are far too ill to stand. Even if I were dying, I would refuse to be seated while Your Highness is standing, he told her. His shoulders seemed to square themselves up involuntarily, and his left hand twitched as though accustomed to the habit of touching a sword hilt. Beverly sat down instantly. With his usual easy grace, he then took a chair nearby. They were quite alone in the antechamber. Even though you were weak on your last legs? Said Beverly. And then she wondered how she could have said anything so inane. Somehow she was beginning to fear that he might not be the ordinary person she thought he was. You are to be discharged from the hospital tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow? His eyes lit with joy. I can go then? I have decided to take you to Edelweiss with me, she said, very much as if that were all there was to it. He stared at her for almost a minute as though doubting what he heard. No, he said at last, his jaw settling and his eyes glistening. That was a terrible setback for Beverly's confidence. Your Highness forgets that I have your promise of absolute freedom. But you are to be free, said Beverly. You have nothing to fear. It's not compulsory, you know. You don't have to go unless you really want to, but my heart is set on having you in the castle guard. His bitter, mocking laugh surprised and wounded her, which he could see, for his contrition was immediate. Pardon, Your Highness, he said. I am a rude, ungrateful wretch, and I deserve punishment instead of reward. Your proposal was so astounding, I forgot myself completely. Whereupon, catching him in this contrite mood, Beverly began a determined assault against his resolution. For an hour she devoted her whole heart and soul to the task of overcoming his prejudices, fears, and objections, meeting all of his protestations firmly and logically, unconscious of the fact that her very enthusiasm was betraying her to him. The first sign of weakness inspired her anew, and at last she was riding over him roughshod at the happy victor. She made promises that Yetive herself could not have made. She offered inducements that never could be carried out, although in her zeal she did not know this. She painted such pictures of ease, comfort, and pleasure that he wondered why royalty did not exchange places with the servants. In the end, overcome by the spirit of adventure and a desire to be near her, Baldos agreed to enter service for 6 months, at the expiration of which he was to be released from all obligations if he wished. But my friends in the mountains, Your Highness, he said as he surrendered, what will become of them? They're waiting for me out there in the wilderness. I can't desert them. Couldn't you get word to them? Let them come into the city too. We'll provide for them, believe me. That at least is impossible, Your Highness. He shook his head sadly. You will have to slay them before you can bring them into the city. My only hope is that Franz may be here tonight. He has permission to enter, and I'm expecting him today or tomorrow. You could send word to them that you are sound and safe, and you can tell them that the Graustark soldiers will be instructed to pay no attention to them whatsoever. They won't be disturbed." He laughed outright at Beverly's enthusiasm. Many times during her eager conversation with Baldos, she had almost betrayed the fact that she was not the princess. Some of her expressions were very unregal, and some of her slips were hopeless as she viewed them in retrospect. What am I? Only the humble goat hunter, hunted to death and eager for a short respite. Do with me as you will, your highness. You will be my princess and sovereign for 6 months at least, he said with a sigh. Perhaps it's for the best. You are just the strangest man I've ever seen, said Beverly, puzzled beyond belief. That night, Franz appeared at the hospital, and he was left alone with Baldos for an hour or more. What passed between them, no outsider knew, though there were tears in the eyes of both of them as they parted. But Franz did not start for the past that night, as they expected. Strange news had come to the ears of the faithful old follower, and he hung around Ganlook until morning came, eager to catch the ear of his leader before it was too late. The coach was drawn up in front of the hospital at 8 o'clock, Beverly triumphant in command. Baldos came down the steps carefully, favoring the newly healed ligaments in his legs. Beverly smiled cheerily at him, and he swung his rakish hat down low. There was no sign of the black patch. Suddenly, he jumped and peered intently into the little knot of people near the coach. A look of anxiety crossed his face. From the crowd advanced a grizzled old beggar who boldly held out his hand. Baldos took the offered hand and then stepped up into the coach. No one noticed the bit of white paper that passed from Franz's palm into the possession of Baldos. Then the coach was off for Edelweiss, the people of Ganlook enjoying the unusual spectacle of a mysterious and apparently undistinguished stranger sitting in luxurious ease next to a fair lady who was riding in the Royal Coach of Graustark. And that is the end of chapter 11. So Beverly seems to get her way a lot. And I mean, I guess that's sort of like the heroine or hero of almost any novel, at least, especially the older ones. I mean, what is it always called? Mary Sue? She's definitely a little bit of a Mary Sue. You know, everybody seems to be falling in line with her plans. But I don't know. We still have quite a bit of this book to go. We are nearing the halfway point, but not quite there yet. So I guess we still have the mystery of who Baldos is, although, spoiler, I do know who he is. And it is kind of being telegraphed, so that isn't going to be too much of a shock to anybody except maybe Beverly. But yeah, we're just going to have to wait and see. I am really enjoying this. And the more I think about it, the more I think it's just probably a difference in maybe... I'm going to have to find some more books from this time period written by Americans as opposed to Europeans. Maybe it's just that Americans have always written with like a looser style. But this is definitely less atmosphere, more action than, say, Jekyll and Hyde or Frankenstein. So it's really interesting. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think down below. Also, please do remember to hit the thumbs up button. It does always make me smile. Subscribe if you hadn't already, because why not? It's free. And I will see you tomorrow.